What's up, guys? In the modern advanced metagame, fighting types are common and they are really good. However, this is a more modern phenomenon. They weren't really explored in depth until relatively recently. So historically, fighting types were looked down on because they didn't have very good defensive utility and they were worn down by spikes and sand. So even if they were pretty dangerous, then you could dance around their attacks and still be alright because they were defensively lacking and susceptible to chip damage. So they might get 1 KO, but that would be it. And generally, players wanted more all-around consistent Pokemon, so fighting types didn't get chosen. The exception was Heracross, because Heracross has Stab Mega Horn, so it threatens a lot more instantly. So you can get your Heracross in, and you don't have to dance around the Celebi or the Claydol, because Heracross just rips right through those. In addition, Heracross also has a good speed stat. It is the fastest of all the viable fighting types, so that helps a lot against the more mid-range portion of the metagame. And it also has Swords Dance. So with secondary Bug Stab, Swords Dance, good speed, then Heracross was the exception. It was OU's fighting type. It was not one of the many fighting types in OU. So we'll be going over the other viable fighting types in OU because there are 6 now, as opposed to just 1. And we will be going over the unique qualities of each one. So we'll start with Heracross. So the only move that is on every Heracross is Mega Horn. And from there, you'll have physical moves, and then Swords Dance, maybe Sub. If you have a choice band, then just more physical moves. But Mega Horn is the only 100% constant. So it can run Choice Band, it can run Leftovers to not get worn down in sand. This is a big one, actually, because, again, a part of the problem with fighting types is that they are susceptible to getting worn down in sand because they want that Choice Band, they want that Lumberry to avoid status, and that means that if you can switch around their attacks for a few turns, then you'll generally be alright because they're losing health. So Leftovers doesn't seem like a great item on a Pokemon like Heracross, which is defensively lacking. I mean, it's not frail, but it's not taking a lot of neutral hits. It doesn't have the typing for it, and it's not that bulky. So you might think, oh, well, why Leftovers? And then you notice in battles with it then how much players will protect on it with Swampert and switch around its resist between slower Pokemon like Celebi and Claydol and Magneton and go, well, if they had Leftovers, then the switching would be doing nothing but prolonging their demise. But their demise would still be inevitable because eventually they are going to have to take that super effective hit. And outside of sand, and that is even more of a problem. But even in sand, if it heals the 6% off every turn, then it becomes really dangerous against the fat teams that it's supposed to destroy. So Leftovers is definitely more prominent nowadays as players become aware that, yeah, this is an offensive Pokemon and we want it to be offensively inclined, but that does not mean that Leftovers is not a great item on it still. So, of course, there is still the Salac Berry sweeping potential of the Sub-Salac Swarm sets, because its Mega Horn gets even stronger at low HP thanks to Swarm, so it goes hand in hand with Substitute and Salac Berry. It's a dangerous sweeper. A Choice Band has brutal immediate power. And of course, Guts is really nice because it means it can't even get statused. I mean, if you burn this thing with Gengar, yeah, it's dying faster, but it's also killing you faster. So lots of great choices. So then you have Rock Slide, which is key. Something unique about fighting types in general in Advance is that they are the rare offensive Pokemon that isn't really helped out by spikes. And you would think, well, what everything likes hazard support. What's different about fighters? Well, the main thing is that they are mainly checked by flying types. Flying types and Pokemon with Levitate, like Gengar and Claydol. And all the spikes in the world are not going to help Heracross break past Salamence or Gyarados or Zapdos. It's not going to push Aerodactyl into range for a Rock Slide KO. Things like that. So spikes are generally teams focused around fighting types. Not that you can't fit spikes on a team with a fighting type, but you generally will, if your offense is centered entirely around the fighting type, then spikes are not really going to be part of your game plan. Like, you could definitely throw Breloom on a spikes offense team, and it'll be good because sleep is good and priority is good and all that, but you are not using spikes to support the fighter. The fighter is just another part of your offense in that scenario. So, yeah, you want Rock Slide. You got to have that flying coverage. Generally, you want Rock Slide. So then the alternative with Heracross is that you trade this in for Raw Power, the set that Astamatitos came up with, the sub Swords Dance variant. So the traditional sub SD set on Hera has Rock Slide over Focus Punch, and it sweeps late game, and it's great, but it requires Magneton because it is so utterly walled by Skarmory. Also, make sure your HP IV is divisible by 4 if you are using Salac Berry, so you can activate your Salac Berry after 3 substitutes. Anyway, so what this Asta set does is it goes, yeah, okay, I don't have the best coverage for Salamence and Zapdos, but I have power. And, you know, even a -1 Focus Punch against Salamence, especially in Sand, it really, really hurts. And you also have the major benefit of being able to Focus Punch Skarmory, and therefore you do not need Magneton, and that opens you up in the Team Builder. Great set. Really, really nasty. Of course, Heracross does not need to go Salac. You can also go, you know, lefties, 3 attacks. Really dangerous. A lot of Brick Break is actually a pretty rare move on Heracross, so sometimes you have these weird scenarios where Snorlax is at, let's say, 60%, and you're gonna go, okay, well, this Heracross can never KO me, so I'm just gonna stay in and blow it up and threat nullified. And then it whips out Brick Break, and you're like, oh, well, nuts. A similar scenario actually happens with Magneton, because Heracross is usually focused on Mega Horn and Rock Slide, and then your sub SD stuff. And if it does run a fighting move, then it's usually Focus Punch. So Brick Break can actually be pretty surprising on it, and it's a good move, obviously. So I would recommend trying out Brick Break Hera in general. It's really, it seems like a weird thing. Yeah, use the stab fighting move on this fighting type with high attack, but it really does go a long way. Not having to hit Mega Horn against T-Tar is great. Having a reliable move to finish off weakened Metagross with, weakened Swampert, things like that. So I would, it really is a big deal. Like, even Blissey will sometimes stand on Heracross going, okay, well, I don't see leftovers, whether or not it has leftovers. I need to chip this Heracross down so my Gengar can finish it off, and it's not going to KO me with Mega Horn, and it's not going to be able to Focus Punch if I Seismic Toss it, and then you just smack him with a Brick Break, and there you go. So, underrated move. Of course, there are lots of other options. If you run Choice Band, then you can drop Swords Dance for HP Ghost for Gengar, or you can even do stuff like Mega Horn, Rock Slide, Brick Break, Focus Punch. But basically, the core, you can even run Jolly if you're one of those players who thinks that, I don't know, there's a time and place for Jolly Heracross. I personally never have really liked it because I think it needs all the power it can get for hitting those switches, especially because Jolly Heracross can very easily just be useless. Like, if the Jolly Heracross, one of its biggest targets is trying to outrun 270 speed Salamence, and then you run into a Mence that just goes neutral max speed. It doesn't even need a plus speed nature to still outrun you, and there you go. Same with Zapdos. So I generally don't find it worth it, and I think the extra power is really significant. So, as soon as you go Jolly, then even stuff like Swampert becomes harder to break through with Mega Horn. And one of the great things about fighting types in general, one of their strengths, is that they destroy common defensive cores in advance. They're a physical attacker that is not stopped by water types. Gyarados being the exception, of course, but Gyarados does not heal in Sand, and it also is vulnerable to Rock Slide. So, and it's also not a traditional bulky water type because it's weak to rock. So it doesn't handle things like T-Tar and DD Mence. So the idea of a fighting type is generally that you are able to slice through things like Swampert and Suicune and Milotic, Rare Vaporeon. So, yeah, there's that aspect to them, and you want to be able to hit those waters as hard as possible because a lot of the time those waters are going to have no other choice but to stay in and slug it out with you, and you are going to want to leave as much damage on them as you can to maximize your odds of actually breaking through the opposing team. And when you're doing less damage to them for that often useless speed boost, it's not the best way to make use of the fighting type strengths, in my opinion. So that's my reasoning for why I really don't like Jolly Heracross. So yeah, it has some benefits, but it's just not worth it. It's very fishy, in my opinion, and I think it's not the most efficient use of a fighting type. Now, before we move on to the next fighting types, I do want to say that the fighting types you see here, they still don't have amazing defensive utility most of the time. They have some, for sure, but they don't have amazing defensive utility. And that's a big thing with glass cannons. Doesn't matter how strong you are if you can't get on the field reliably. So the go-to way to get a fighting type on the field is to pair it with Baton Pass Zapdos. And this has been the crux of a lot of strides forward in the metagame in the last couple of years. BP Zapdos acting like a U-turner Volt Switch in later generations, making up for the frailty of such a Pokemon by just forcing something out and then bringing that Pokemon in for free. You don't even have to risk a double switch with it. Of course, that is very helpful. Like if you have something like a, let's say a Zapdos, obviously. If you have something like a offensive Jirachi that is walled by a Tyranitar, and you could just double switch to your fighting type, and boom, there's your good matchup. There's your free turn to rip into the opponent. But obviously, that's prediction heavy, and not everyone likes to play like that. But with Baton Pass Zapdos, then you circumvent the biggest issue, that sometimes it's hard to get these guys on the field. Because Zapdos draws in slow checks like Blissey, Snorlax, Regice, sometimes T-Tar, and fighters are able to take advantage of those perfectly. That is the strength of fighters. They are able to come in on common defensive pillars of the metagame, on the common specially defensive pillars of the metagame, namely Blissey and Snorlax, and they threaten them like nothing else does. They have the stab fighting moves to actually make those things go, oh, that thing can take me out in one hit without exploding. So there's that, and they are also very difficult to wall for common defensive cores. Like, if you consider the standard defensive team of Advanced, or just the standard team, period, T-Tar, Skarmory, Blissey, Swampert, Gengar, +1, those generally do not enjoy switching into fighters, because that big defensive core of T-Tar, Skarm, Pert, Bliss, no fighting resist to be found. Neither of the physical walls likes eating fighting hits. You got 2 Pokemon O-code by them as well. And Gengar is not an ironclad fighting answer. As we know with Heracross, should be running Guts on non-Salic sets. And it's not a great check. I mean, you need Fire Punch, which is hard to fit, and even then it doesn't exactly do the job entirely. So it's generally you have a bunch of Pokemon weak to the fighter, and then a shaky check or two, depending on the last. The last usually can't switch in. So even if it can revenge kill. So you have a very threatening, that's the strength of the fighting type. You have a very, very threatening Pokemon to the vast majority of the best team, or the most standard team, and, just defensive cores in general. The advanced metagame is not rife with Pokemon that shrug off fighters. They are offensively potent as hell. Sure, they have their struggles. They're not going to rip through everything without a problem at all, but that's their strength, being able to bust through the opposing defenses with ease. I mean, even checks like Celebi and Claydol to some of these others, they are not ironclad. So the thing that was holding back their usage before was an inability to get them on the field, and an inability to make them take out more than one Pokemon reliably, because of things like their vulnerability to passive damage, and with our newfound appreciation for things like leftovers even on offensive Pokemon that aren't that bulky, just to prevent them from getting ruined by sand, and further exploration of Baton Pass Zapdos in particular, and just more exploration of the metagame as it goes on. This is a great example of how old metagames evolve even when they're old. So that is what has led us to this new fighting renaissance, let's call it. Because, I mean, look at other common defensive Pokemon in the metagame. Celebi is a good fighting answer, but it's not a perfect one. And you have a lot of Pokemon that are just very, very vulnerable to it. So, I mean, most of the checks, like Salamence is the best natural check, but it's still weak to Rock Slide, doesn't heal in Sand, outside, unless you're running a very bulky Wish set, which is rare. I mean, Zapdos isn't a great check. So, yeah, you have a lot of offensive potential with these guys, and it just is a matter of getting them on the field. Another nice thing about most fighting types, besides Heracross and Blaziken, is that in a one-on-one against Tyranitar, then Zapdos can BP out to the fighters safely. And I say besides Heracross and Blaziken because they do not resist Rock. So they can't switch into a banned Rock Slide. But the others are good at switching into Tar in a one-on-one. Of course, you prefer to not take a hit switching in, so you can maybe take a hit later and make yourself even more difficult to deal with. Like being able to take a Surf from Suicune or Swampert, that's really helpful. But if you do take a hit from T-Tar, it's not the end of the world, as long as you are on top of your game and make the most out of your Heracross, or your fighter in general, because you have to be aggressive with your fighting type. You can't just let the opponent dance around it easily. Like, you can't just use Mega Horn and let the opposing Salamence switch into it every time. You're going to want to Rock Slide if you're facing a Blissey. So, you can't just go straight... I mean, sometimes the opponent just will not have the tools to switch into you. So, yeah, in that case, then absolutely go ahead. Rock them with one. But most of the time, you are going to get a lot out of being aggressive with this. These are the kinds of Pokemon that reward... These are the high-risk, high-reward Pokemon in advance. It's whereas something like a DD Tar using EQ on the Switch to wear down Swampert, that's not getting you very far, even though it's a prediction even if you get that prediction correct, you're not doing a whole lot. But if you get a prediction right with a fighting type, then you are really opening a huge hole in the opponent's team. So, next up, Hariyama. So, Hariyama is unique because it is the only Pokemon on this list that can also be used defensively, and that is its more well-known variant. So we'll go over that briefly. So, it's unique also because it has Whirlwind, and phasing moves are always good, and it of course has Knockoff. Now, if you are more interested in Knockoff Hariyama and how it functions, I have a video called The Obnoxiousness of Knockoff, and I spelled obnoxiousness Obnoxiousness. So I got knock in there. And yeah, so if you are interested in that, because this video is more about the offensive potential of fighting types. But the basic thing about Hariyama is that it is really good defensively against Tyranitar, Snorlax, and Knockoff is amazing in a permanent Sand metagame. And, I mean, it's always amazing, but even with low base power, then in a permanent Sand metagame, it's worth it. So, you remove leftovers from something like a recovering Starmie or Celebi, and they are really struggling for the rest of the game, and it's a lot easier to play around them, because eventually they will be forced to recover and burn PP, and you can take advantage of that in a longer game. I used one of these in an SPL game against Conflict, where Hariyama was amazing, so you can check that out if you want. I did an SPL video. Anyway, so that's defensive Hariyama, which we have covered in another video. So now we're going to go over to the offensive potential of Hariyama. So Hariyama and Machamp are very similar offensively. You got this slow but pretty bulky Pokemon. I say pretty bulky, even though Hariyama has a huge HP stat because his defenses are so low. So, they're similarly bulky-ish, and high attack, and they have guts, and then there's some differences, of course. Now, Hariyama is weaker, but thanks to the efforts of Asamatitos, who I believe was the first to start using offensive Yama, then we see its advantages over Machamp. Mainly its high HP stat. And what that does is allow it to switch into Blissey a lot more easily, because it is not nearly as threatened as Machamp is by Seismic Toss. So you're not going to really want to invest in HP on Hariyama. You want the bulk too badly. So, oh yeah, both Machamp and Hariyama use Cross Chop, which is fairly limited in distribution. So, anyway, so what you do, and you're not going to be whirlwinding most of the time either. Now, you might still want Knockoff. Hariyama has a lot of options for its offensive variants, but the general idea is the same. Bulky fighting type, counters T-Tar pretty well. It's not a hard counter because strong Earthquakes still sting, but you are able to shrug off mixed sets, DD sets, choice band rock slides, 1 or 2, and you are able to respond with an OHKO. Most T-Tar counters don't OHKO T-Tar back, whereas Hariyama very easily does. So you're going to want to do that, and that's his defensive use. And of course the switching into Blissey Seismic Toss, and oh yeah, if you compare this Hariyama with a Wish Blissey of your own, which is good on both offensive and defensive teams, because yeah, Blissey fits on offense as well, then you really are just gravy against both T-Tar and Bliss, because T-Tar, you just shrug its attacks off and you keep on trucking, and Blissey, even Seismic Toss does even less. So yeah, with Yama, you're going to want a lot of attack, and then a good chunk of defense, just to take Earthquakes. And then, some special defense, so you're not a total goober to those attacks. The number can change. I mean, some people like some speed EVs to outrun minus speed Swampert, relaxed Pert. But I am personally more about getting all the bulk I can out of Hariyama. So you could feasibly just run max attack, max defense, and be fine. Of course, I am kind of an EV freak, so I like to calc all my stuff. But for most players' purposes, then, you can do the calcs yourselves against specific attacks, but something like this is generally going to get the job done, and then some. So, now, as for Hariyama's offensive moves, of course it's got Guts. Thick Fat is more for the defensive sets, because those are more focused on being able to check as much as possible, but with Guts, we want this thing to be an offensive menace. So, one thing Hariyama has going for it over Machamp is Surprise Factor, because Hariyama could be offensive, and it could be defensive, and there's no real way to tell. Even through team composition, you could very well have a defensive Hariyama on an offensive team, and an offensive Hariyama on a defensive team. There's no real way to suss it out until it starts attacking. So that's what makes Focus Punch really nice on it, because it's a huge first hit. So again, something like Salamence switches into a Focus Punch, even if it intimidates you and shrugs the hit off, still a big, big hit. So that's one way to make the most out of its talents. And of course, it's got Rock Slide for Mence and Zapdos. I'm not crazy about Rock Slide on Hariyama, personally, because I think Knockoff tends to get the job done really nicely against those flyers regardless. I mean, just removing leftovers against Salamence and Zapdos is enormous. Of course, Rock Slide is still pretty good, like especially in a one-on-one against something like Moltres or Charizard, then it's really valuable. The thing is that Hariyama has a lot of moves to try and fit in here, so something's got to go. Either Focus Punch's got to go, Rock Slide's got to go, or a Hidden Power's got to go, and all of them have their merits. So it really depends on the player, how they like to play, the other Pokemon on the team. So, but there's a lot of merit to all these moves. So, then of course there's a Hidden Power. Now I am generally one of the big things about the non-Heracross fighting types, well, and non-Blaziken, I guess, is that they are usually not so great against Celebi with HP Ghost. That's why if you're going to run an HP between Ghost and Bug on Yama, you're going to want Bug. Because look, Knockoff in Sand ruins Gengar, absolutely ruins it. So you really don't need coverage for it. That's one reason I still like Knockoff even on offensive Hariyama. Some players, like Asta in particular, and I believe Linear as well, were using, and I think McMegan too. Basically, a lot of tournament players, Watermess and other guys, were using no knockoff offensive Yama. But then I think Asta was still using knockoff on offensive Yama, and I personally think it's such a great move that I would use it even with the offensive investment. Because yeah, the extra coverage can be really nice, no doubt about that. But the thing is that Yama knockoff is coverage, like in its own way. Because it ruins Salamence, ruins Zapdos, ruins Gengar, and Rock Slide just isn't the same in that regard. Make sure that bulky stuff like Wish Jirachi can't even hope to stall you out. Bulky Metagross losing its leftovers is a death sentence. It's just such a great move to have. So, and plus, in a way, it makes Hariyama tougher to deal with, because you get in once on Blissey, you knock off whatever the switch-in hates the knockoff. Later you come back, and that switch-in is going to be even worse. And it's easier than having to, because you only have to knock something off once, as opposed to having to Rock Slide Salamence multiple times. So I personally am a huge fan of it. So yeah, and if you're going to pick a Hidden Power, anyway, then it should be Bug. because this way Celebi's scared to switch into you, and you still hit Claydol, very annoying otherwise. Still hit Starmie, and Gengar ruined by knockoff. So yeah, lots of great options for Yama. It is a really terrific Pokemon, and we've been seeing a lot more of it in recent times. I hope to see that continue. So I'm sure you could do like other things on this. Like I've been using Whirlwind on one team because Baton Pass Celebi is annoying, Swords Dance specifically, and it's just a nice move to have for Suicune actually. Rest, Sleep Talk Suicune can be irritating to some of the balanced teams that this Hariyama tends to find itself on. Starmie, Metagross, Blissey kind of stuff, which can't really hurt Suicune as soon as it rests. So it's nice to have that option. Also nice for Ninjask nonsense. So it's definitely worth considering, but for the most part, you should be using moves that do damage on this Hariyama. So, yeah, terrific Pokemon, does a whole lot of great stuff. So, now Machamp. Machamp is the more all-out offensive side of the Hariyama coin. So, what it loses in bulk and high HP, it makes up for in power and speed. So, Machamp's extra speed over Yama, 5 base, but that means a lot because Hariyama's max speed is 199, which is, good for Scarms and stuff, but not so great. Whereas Machamp's max speed is good enough for things like bulky Suicune, Milotic, you have to make Milotic use more than 8 speed EVs to outrun you. So, those are some big targets, pretty much all all-out offensive Scarms. So, and the bulk, you don't really, with Hariyama, you are using its bulk a lot more. You are taking more attacks, so you want to invest in those defenses. With Machamp, you are pretty much going to take an attack, or you're not, with or without bulk. So that way you get to invest in the speed and really get more out of it. So that is why Machamp is the all-out offensive side. You're not really switching this into Tyranitar over the course of a game, like you would Hariyama. However, when you do get Machamp in, then you are going to cause a lot of pain. Now, the standard set is Bulk Up. So, Bulk Up, destruction against a lot of defensive teams. They have a very difficult time dealing with it. So, all kinds, Scarm, Bliss, Swampert stuff, Milotic, Claydol stuff hates it. So, it's really, really brutal. So, that's one way to do it. And unlike Heracross, who similarly is dangerous to those teams, then Bulk Up Machamp lacks a weakness to any of Dugtrio's moves and is boosting its defense. Bulk Up Heracross has been experimented with before, but it's just not as good. Whereas Bulk Up Machamp just has the better typing for it, since it only has a singular weakness to flying, meaning that Dugtrio's Earthquake actually outdamages Aerial Ace against it. And after a Bulk Up, it doesn't do very much at all, so you just slice through a lot of those teams really easily. This guy I would consider using Bug on, mainly because you want to Oko Gengar after that Bulk Up, and you don't want it to do stuff like you don't want it to hit you twice. You don't want it to be able to Thunderbolt then explode on you, things like that. So I would consider it, but at the same time, I still think it's generally not worth it, especially because this kind of Machamp tends to get paired with offensive teams packing something like Houndoom, or some sort of Pursuiter that really ruins Gengar. So it's generally not the biggest deal. And Houndoom's not as reliable at taking out Celebi because of its bulk and recovery. So generally having Bug is preferable. Just being able to threaten Celebi so hard is generally more, especially because you are still very good against Gengar, even without HP Ghost. Whereas without HP Bug against Celebi, then you're kind of up the creek. So it's preference, but either works. I've also seen some players use Earthquake over Bulk Up, so that's an option. The super effective hit on Metagross can be pretty nice if you don't find yourself bulking up very much. And then there's the option of Choice Band. Now, this one is more prediction reliant because, you hate stuff like Gengar coming in on your fighting move and getting worn down by sand and Protect ruining you. But, on the other hand, the immediate damage against stuff like Metagross is just devastating. I mean, you get this thing in, you cross-chop, and, Mence cries. Especially because a crit cross-chop has a high critical hit ratio, which I believe in Gen 3 is the same as in Gen 2, meaning it's still 25%. I believe they switched it to 12.5 in Gen 4. Correct me on that if I'm wrong, but I still believe it is 25% in Gen 3. So either way, if you crit Mence, it just dies to Cross Chop. It's crazy. So, not something to rely on, obviously, but it serves to illustrate how powerful it is. Because even without the crit, then you're still doing a ton of damage. So... And its Focus Punch is, it's got a higher attack stat than Heracross, so its Banded Focus Punch threatens to straight up OHKO max HP Skarmory. I mean, Heracross has a 25% chance to do that with Focus Punch. I don't recall what Machamp's percent is, but it's higher, obviously. So, it's really, really dangerous. Of course, Bulk Up is definitely the more consistent option because of the longevity factor and, being able to switch moves. It's really key. Because as soon as you start struggling with that longevity, and that susceptibility to protect, and being able to get switched around on, and then that's when you start really buying into that whole reason why fighting types weren't used so much in older Advanced to begin with. Because those are the whole reasons why they weren't. Because they were struggling with prediction, they were struggling with making the right move, struggling to stay alive, struggling to take down one Pokemon. If anything more than one Pokemon, if even that one Pokemon, protect, they'll just die eventually because they're going to get worn down by everything under the sun. So generally, CB Machamp is fun and really, really dangerous in the right matchup. But Bulk Up is overall a lot more consistent, and it can really threaten a lot of standard defensive teams. Some people were so afraid of Machamp for a while that they were making their Skarms hit 210 speed. Their Milotics were hitting 210 speed as well. Now, Machamp is being a little overshadowed by Hariyama right now, since Hariyama started using offensive sets, because of Hariyama's higher HP and knockoff. So it's more of a sustainable threat throughout the game. But, make no mistake, Machamp is not to be slept on. It is terrifying. So, that's Machamp for you, and we'll just leave it on Lefty's Bulk Up. Now, next up is Breloom. Now, I have already talked about Breloom in a lot of videos, so we're not going to go over the whole 9 yards here. If you're interested, then you can consult my video about Undisputed's Charizard Breloom team. And that more or less explains what Breloom does. So we know Breloom. So if you're not familiar with Breloom, then I would recommend pausing this and going to watch that video and then coming back to this afterwards. But with Breloom, then it's mostly, now that we know what it does, we now are more figuring out the optimizations for its set. So that begins with its nature. Adamant was the standard before. Jolly is preferable now, and I am generally not a fan of plus speed nature, so it really pains me to say this, but I do think Jolly is better. Now, I will say, I do sometimes miss the extra punch on Focus Punch and Sky Uppercut against things like Skarmory and Zapdos and Salamence, but the speed is really huge in making sure Breloom is still effective against offensive teams, because it gives it a lot more opportunity against them, and that way you don't have this Pokemon that's kind of dead weight against faster stuff. So, here's the thing with Jolly. One of Breloom's biggest targets is, of course, Tyranitar, like every fighting type. Now, one of the most popular Tyranitar's variants is UD-Tar, or Lumberry Mixtar, and that almost always runs plus speed now. So it hits 243, Adamant Breloom hits 239, gets outsped. And with that Breloom set, then we'll just get outrun and Ice Beam, Fire Blast, HP Grass, Brick Break, so you get Ice Beamed. You don't even get the chance to pray for a Fire Blast miss. It's just going to destroy you. So in that situation, you could try to Mach Punch KO it, but you're not KOing it from full. And it just kind of, and if they switch because they're not actually that set, then you are just, throwing out a flimsy Mach Punch into Salamence. It's generally not a good move. Now, with Jolly, then you still don't risk the Spore unless you absolutely have to, because you don't want to just get lumberied and destroyed. But what you can do is use Sky Uppercut. So if that T-Tar is actually UD-Tar and stays in thinking, alright, I'm going to outspeed, or I'm going to lum, or I'm going to lum, and I'm going to... No, it's not and or. You just You think you're going to outspeed Adamant Breloom, just Ice Beam it to oblivion. And, you know, if it's Jolly, then they might Spore. Then instead you just go for Sky Uppercut, and if T-Tar stays in, which they very often do, then you just eliminate them for free, and you get to sleep something else later, and you did not risk your Breloom dying. And if they switch, then, first of all, you know that they're probably not Lum. You know, probably. You'll want to make sure 100% before you commit to going for it next time. But, on the bright side, if they do switch to that Salamence or that Zapdos, you hit them with Sky Uppercut on the switch, in Sand, because they're switching out of T-Tar, so you know it's there. And that is a lot better than Mach Punching them on the switch. So now, when you get your Breloom in later, and you Spore, and then you Focus Punch, then they've already taken chip from Sky Uppercut, as opposed to Mach Punch, and that makes them easier to finish off with the Mach Punch. So, that's a big part of the Jolly Nature push. Another reason is Endeavor Swampert, who sits at 240, so 1 point above Adamant Breloom. So you are... outrunning that one is really big, because otherwise you think, oh, I have Breloom against Swampert, I get a free Spore, and you get outsped and Ice Beamed. Not fun. Then there's other stuff like defensive Zapdos and Celebi, if you want to get a Spore off on them. But they're not as big as something like offensive Cloyster, who sits at 247. Lots of offensive Suicunes. Offensive Suicunes are going faster, again, mostly because of Breloom. And you get another big one, which is Timid Vaporeon, which is actually another popular partner with fighting types because of its sub-pass antics. And I should mention now, before I forget, that sub-pass Vaporeon is big because it passes 101 HP substitutes. So when Blissey comes in on Vaporeon and goes for Seismic Toss, then Vaporeon passes the sub, and it's 101 HP, so Seismic Toss doesn't break it. So you get your fighting type in behind a sub. Asta had a great team with this. So the idea is that they're forced to go to Blissey because everything else dies to Vappy's powerful Hydro Pumps. So you sub up on Blissey, and then you send in your Heracross against the Blissey, and you maintain a sub against it. It's really brutal. Anyway, that Vaporeon very often goes Timid now because it likes to run Salac Berry, and it's just good in general for these targets we're talking about as well. So Jolly Breloom also gets the jump on such a Vaporeon. And it also outruns Metacham, which is also popular now. So, Timid Magneton, you get the jump on those because they run HP Fire a lot. So, you know, you don't lose to them either. It's just very useful against a whole swath of common Pokemon. So, to summarize, you guarantee you don't speed tie against something like an Adamant Max Speed Choice Band Metagross either, which is really good. So to summarize, with Jolly, you are outrunning the following that you would not with Adamant, the following relevant targets. So, Choice Band Metagross, which you would tie, Endeavor Swampert, Mixtar or UD-Tar, we'll leave out offensive or defensive Celebi and Zapdos because those aren't as relevant because you're not destroying them. Some offensive Suicunes, all Cloysters pretty much. A lot of Gyarados, I didn't mention that. Gyarados sits at 249 Adamant Gyarados sits at 249 because that beats Dugtrio at +1. And then Vaporeon and Magneton. So those are some big targets to be outrunning, because you completely flip the matchup on its head by being able to do that. So yeah, Jolly is the thing. Now, the other thing that people are tweaking right now on Breloom is the moveset, because it has a lot of options. Now, I and several other people came up with this set at the same time, mainly because it gives you a fighting move for every scenario. You want your Focus Punch for your big hit after you Spore something, or on predicted switches. You want your consistent Sky Uppercut stab, so you are able to actually threaten Blissey and Tyranitar in a one-on-one when you can't Focus Punch. And you like Mach Punch just because it finishes things off really nicely, and because it allows you to Mach Punch the Dugtrio coming in to Revenge Kill you and putting it into pursuit range for your Tyranitar, thus making for a nice lure and remove Dugtrio strategy. So this is the standard, it's tough to go wrong with, but Breloom does have a lot of really nice options. So, is this still playing? Yes. Okay, so the main one people consider is Stun Spore. This is because, you can Focus Punch a Salamence or a Zapdos, but the thing about Breloom is that it generally, after it's spored something, its utility goes down a lot, so it's generally, if you have to choose something to sack, then it's generally going to be Breloom. I should mention that Mach Punch also has great utility in keeping DD Tar in check, but, it's minor in comparison to the other DD Tar checks you should be having on your offensive team. You know, you don't put Breloom on a team to fix a DD Tar weakness, put it like that. So the other thing is Stun Spore, because, yeah, Focus Punch is annoying for Ments and Zapdos, and, you know, Gyarados, but they're not really permanently annoyed by it unless they're going to switch into Breloom multiple times, and that usually isn't the case. Breloom usually isn't going to get so many opportunities unless you're really playing your ass off, and that's not something you can really rely on because that goes both ways. So what Stun Spore does is offer a more permanent way to ruin those Pokemon. I mean, you Stun Spore Immense, it is dead, essentially. It also offers you something to do against Gengar, because you'll notice with 3 fight moves you are completely useless against Gar, and that is generally not a problem, because when you're trying to HP Ghost a Gengar switch, you have to do it twice, so it's generally more reliable to pair Breloom with a Pursuit Tar. In addition to doing that whole cool Dugtrio removal thing, you also have the reliable Gengar removal, so that's generally the preferred option to HP Ghost. But Stun Spore helps that process out, because it means you don't have to, you know, either attack if you think they're staying in, or if just switch to Pursuit Tar. You get a little mid-ground. So it gives you... Stun Spore is really nice. Now, it's pretty useless against Celebi because of Natural Cure. I mean, you can paralyze it and then try to pursue it with T-Tar, so, you know, that's nice as well, but not super reliable, and, you know, you're not always going to be running Pursuit T-Tar. Sometimes you're going to want Pursuit Metagross, so you don't have to waste a slot on T-Tar, so you can use a different moveset on T-Tar. So, Stun Spore isn't doing you much good against Celebi there. So another option is HP Bug, because that hits Celebi, that hits the bulky Starmie that's really popular now, and it hits Claydol, who is also a pretty good Breloom check. So, again, HP Bug tends to be better than Ghost, once more. You're just better off, you know, with the Pokemon that can hit Gengar with another move, then you do that, and if not, then you just Pursuit it. So, the other moves like Leech Seed and, you know, Vapakuno likes HP Grass, which it's funny because it's got such a pathetic special attack stat, but just, you know, make it naive, and you actually, because Swampert does handle Breloom one-on-one, funnily enough, once Sleep Clause is active, but with HP Grass, you actually become a grass type that lures in Swampert. It's really funny. Yeah, masterpiece of comedy and all that, but it is worth considering. So HP Bug, HP Grass, Stun Spore, and some players, mainly linear, I believe, like Swords Dance, because with Mach Punch and good use of Spore, you know, holding it back on switches, then you can clean teams up late game. It's pretty nasty. So those are the options that Breloom is toying with at the time of this video, and I don't think anything else is really worth it. Sub's not worth it, doesn't help with any of Breloom's issues. I guess if you're afraid of Sky Uppercut's accuracy, which is surprisingly terrible when you need it to hit, you can run Brick Break. I'm generally not a fan, though. And then there's not really much else, unless you want to risk Dynamic Punch like a weirdo. No, it gets Mind Reader, I guess. But, yeah, don't do that. Stick with the above. And mainly, the main consideration is Jolly. Alright, so Blaziken. Blaziken is a unique fighting type because it is also part fire, and its nice stab Fire Blast means that it can OHKO Skarmory and Metagross, which these other fighting types wish they could do. It also gives it a stab move that is good against Zapdos. So in a one-on-one, Zamog was toying with this because it's great against most of the common leads, against Zapdos, Tyranitar, Skarmory, and Metagross. And you scare out all of those, and Zapdos will generally Thunderbolt you into Blaze range, and then you could smack it back with Fire Blast. For that strategy, I generally prefer Charcoal on Blaziken. Well, I prefer Charcoal for a few reasons. If you're trying to get into Blaze range, then it generally helps, because Blaziken does not have the survivability of Charizard, because it's hit by spikes. So, Leftovers is good on it, but, you know, not mandatory. And Overheat, I prefer Overheat for A, the increased accuracy, B, the increased power against bulkier Zapdos, because even offensive Zapdos likes to run bulk. So, generally prefer it. And it's also it's a hard smack on things like Salamence switches. So that way you don't have to think, oh, am I going to predict and, you know, use Toxic or whatever? No, you're going to overheat the Metagross switch, and if they go to Salamence, you're going to hit them hard regardless. That last move is up for grabs. I mean, some people like Toxic, some people like Swords Dance, some people like Thunder Punch for Gyarados, because that is a move that Blaziken gets. but I generally think that Overheat is the safest. It just helps Blaziken do its job best. So Charcoal is definitely worth considering. Some people actually like Saligberry, which is really nasty. And Blaziken has some other options, like Choice Band, because it lures in Milotic, which is pretty good against the standard fighter. Now, this is one downside of Blaziken. It does invite in Milotic pretty hard. But, you know, that's nothing that can't be tweaked with either some team support or just some moveset changes. Like you put Focus Punch in this last slot, and suddenly Milotic's not liking that very much. You know, same with Swords Dance. And yeah, you have the options to toy with it. I generally wouldn't use Choice Band because one of Blaziken's strengths, especially on Blaziken, you know, with this Pokemon that slices through Scar and Bliss so hard, is being able to switch moves, but the upside can be worth it. And of course, it's got a huge attack stat, same as Hariyama. So you are hitting, you know, if you go for CB Focus Punches, then you're hitting Salamence hard on the switch. And Salamence is also a fighting type that Gengar really doesn't want to come in on, again, because of that stab fire move. So this is generally what I prefer, you know, Charcoal, especially if you are, you know, trying to get into Blaze range early in the game. But of course, mid game, you do that's if you are letting Blaziken take that Zapdos Thunderbolt early in the game. In that case, then I do think Charcoal is better. But if you're using Blaziken as a mid game attacker, then you would generally prefer Leftovers, so you're not getting protected on by Skarmory or Swampert. And so they can't just switch around your attacks and then take you out with Gengar Thunderbolt. Oh, another move, Substitute, obviously. I forgot to mention that one. That one's easy because you really punish them trying to get extra leftovers out of Protect. You make sure that your moves hit the exact target you're looking for. So you don't have to predict, like, oh, am I going to HP Grass the Swampert switch, or am I going to Fire Blast the Gengar? You sub and you see, and then you make sure you smack something. So sub is also a great move, with leftovers, of course. So lots of options for Blaziken, and just it's a good lead. It's definitely the best lead of the other fighters, because the other fighters have a good matchup against T-Tar lead, but you know, when it comes to lead off like Skarm and Zapdos, then they're more helpless. But with Blaziken, you have the tools to mess with them more. So as long as you're running, you know, Choice Band and stuff is fun, but I think Fire Blast, Sky Uppercut, HP Grass, one of Leftovers or Charcoal, depending on where you're using it, and then the last slot is up for grabs. I think sub is kind of unnecessary, sometimes counterproductive, because that way you put yourself into range for the Thunderbolts from Zapdos and Gengar, and I generally am not a huge fan of that. But, you know, it can be really useful, and you're not going to want to ditch HP Grass for HP Ice. I know it's tempting because it actually has a special attack stat, so you can potentially really deck Mence, but you're not going to want to get walled by Swampert. It's just not worth it. So, yeah, and then, you know, sub or overheat. So that's how Blaziken works. Fairly simple, actually. And, oh yeah, having a stab fire move also means that Celebi doesn't want to come in on it. It's like Heracross in that regard. And it also smacks Claydol pretty hard with that stab as well, which is really, really nice. Threatening a Fortress Oko is good as well. Jirachi, the same. So, and then of course the big guns of Metagross and Skarmory. I mean, you can look at Blaziken either as a fighting type with, you know, Fire Stab, which is how we're doing it, or you can look at it as a fire type with Fighting Stab for things like Blissey and T-Tar, which is how I've referred to it in past videos. So, either work. They're both really good. So, yeah, if you're using Thunder Punch, you're really just fishing for the Gyarados. It's not strong enough to make a difference against Starmie realistically. So, stick to... Generally, it's the same principle as with Heracross. Stick to this Pokemon's strengths. Don't try and make it counter, you know, be able to hit everything. Like Toxic. Yeah, you could Toxic Gyara or Mence on the Switch, but I would wager that, yeah, it's nice, but you're probably better off just attacking them. And because the teams Blaziken fits on, like most fighting types, most offensive fighting types, generally operate at an aggressive pace. I mean, even Skarm, Bliss, Spikes teams with fighting types are still offensive in nature. So yeah, it can be nice, but at the same time, you are generally going to prefer being able to hit hard and fast in as many scenarios as possible, as opposed to using Toxic. So, if you're going to run an offensive last move here, then make it Overheat. So, that's been my Overheat Blaziken public service announcement. Finally, Metacham. Metacham is the purest offensive fighting type, just because of its pure power. So it is effectively base gajillion attack. So Metacham is a big... when I mentioned that people would play around fighting types, losing health and sand, and prediction, fighting move into Gengar, bad, stuff like that, Metacham is the poster child for that, because everyone goes, oh man, this Pokemon with 1,000,000 attack, it needs more attack, I need to give it a choice band. That's what leads it to lose to things like Protect Swampert, Protect anything, getting switched around via resistances. I mean, yeah, it hits hard even through resistances, but you lose the amount of impact there, especially when you're on a timer in sand, even when they're not attacking you. So leftovers on Metacham is the way to go. Now, I will say, Asta has been making great use of a choice band Metacham with Fake Out, and I really admire his approach to using it. But on average, the more consistent Metacham is leftovers, because it gives you a lot more room for error, and that is generally what you like. It's easier to play with, easier to play around, and in a lot of ways, then you take away a lot of ways that the opponent would be able to play around Metacham, i.e. Protect, i.e. switching Gengar into a fighting move, and bam, that's it. Now it has to switch out. So, I mean, you still don't want to stand on a Will-O-Wisp, but you can still smack it with a Shadow Ball. Fighting types, team building strides have been made, and you can fit 2 fighting types in the same team as long as the rest of your defensive core is good. Especially helpful with Hariyama, because it makes up the defensive core, whereas the others are kind of sketchy in that regard. But even like 2 all-out offensive fighting types can fit on offensive and more balanced teams alike, as long as you can handle threats, which is not that big a deal, which is not that hard to do, I should say, which is one of the beautiful things about Advance. So yeah, you can Shadow Ball the Gengar, and then your Breloom is more dangerous or whatever. Your Heracross probably, because now you can Mega Horn more freely. But just knowing that they can't switch around you and you lost health. Because, compare Metacham uses Brick Break, Gengar switches in without leftovers, then you lost 6% for free. And with leftovers, you might have to switch out, but you didn't lose 6%. So you can repeat the process later when you get Metacham in on Blissey. And, the thing is, when you make those switches with Gengar against Metacham, I mean, against these other guys, you can usually take an HP Bug, an HP Ghost if it's not banded, which it usually isn't. But against Metacham, you switch into a Shadow Ball. I mean, it doesn't even need the band. Being Shadow Ball is great because it means you are not forced to use a hidden power. But, because of its sheer strength, then, if you switch into a Shadow Ball with Gengar, you die. And the extra power is huge against Claydol as well. So, I mean, this thing is just insanely strong. I mean, Focus Punch smacks almost everything. It's really strong. Rock Slide against Mence is great, and just its fighting stabs are great. Even against Mence and Sand, that's the go-to example because Intimidate, Fighting Resist, and fits on a lot of teams. So Metacham does have some other options, even if you're not running Choice Band. I mean, I wouldn't run Fake Out besides Choice Band, but you can also run HP Bug if you like, because Celebi is not a great counter to Metacham, but in a pinch it will do. So I guess I should mention that Metacham is the purest fighter because it's best offensively in terms of sheer power, but also has the least offense or defensive value. I mean, that typing resists, nada. Even Blaziken's pretty bad defensively, but at least it resists fire, whereas Metacham resists nothing. But on the other hand, Metacham is neutral to Psychic, and that is also great. Now, in a one-on-one against something like Jirachi, its power is kind of offset by the fact that it's forced to use Brick Break for stab, as opposed to, Blaziken Sky Uppercut, Breloom Sky Uppercut, Machamp and Hariyama Cross Chop, and Heracross Mega Horn. But it's still just incredibly strong, and you just marvel at the damage it dishes out. So, HP Bug is good because, force the issue against Celebi even further, and if you're running something like a Pursuit Tar, then you can ditch Shadow Ball for sure. And HP Bug can be nice. Metacham also has Recover. Now, I generally don't think this is really worthwhile because it just does not have great bulk, but it can be nice. Like if someone's protecting for lefties, then you can Recover, and whoops, now you can switch into another Seismic Toss from Blissey later on. Another option is Sub, natural partner to Focus Punch, especially because it hits so hard with Focus Punch that sometimes you think, okay, come on, what am I doing with this Rock Slide coverage? Rock Slide can definitely, go. You can run Sub over it. You can run Bulk Up, and I would definitely say Bulk Up is better than Choice Band on average, because you also remove the potential for Dugtrio to revenge kill you. So, Earthquake does a ton to Metacham because Bulk is pretty pitiful. But yeah, I wouldn't run Bulk Up Recover or anything like that. That's, a little not... Yeah, I wouldn't. You want that instant explosive power of Focus Punch, but something like Brick Break, Shadow Ball, Bulk Up Focus Punch is really nasty. So you can go toe to toe against something like a defensive Metagross, which would otherwise be a pretty decent makeshift check to you. And yeah, so Bulk Up is good, Recover is good, HP Bug is good. Well, Recover's not that good, but Sub is another big one. That's a natural one. But yeah, in terms of sheer strength, Metacham is nasty. I mean, people are reconsidering their speed tiers now. Now that Metacham has seen some tournament success, they think, all right, I gotta go above 259. I gotta hit that 260, or higher. I've seen Zapdos EV just for Metacham. Usually some Zapdos you would think, oh, I'm gonna go to 270, but now it's like, oh, well, I'll just go to 260 and hit Metacham. That's the crucial benchmark. I can play around Heracross, but Metacham is really scary. It is on another level of power, so. Yeah, does it have anything else? Oh, it has Baton Pass. I'm sure you could, find something to do with that. But it's generally not worth it, because Metacham does not really... I mean, I'm sure you could fit on Choice Band or something to scout switches, but with Metacham, you are generally best dishing out as much damage as possible. It's the worst on the defensive side. I mean, Breloom has great Quake Slide resistance, Metacham just Rock Slide, but not a very sturdy Rock Slide switch, but it'll get the job done. But Breloom also has Spore, which is utility in and of itself, because suddenly you are shutting down things like, let's say, slow Zapdos that you wouldn't actually handle one-on-one. So that adds an extra layer to it, whereas Metacham is just kind of like, eh. And yeah, Rock Slide is nice for making sure Zapdos can't become a makeshift check to you. But if you like making sure you hit your target, then you can sub up and just slam everything. Of course, 4 attacks I think is the most consistent, just because the sheer power means if you're ever unsure, you can Brick Break and you're still going to do a strong chunk to whatever faster fight resist switches in, besides Gengar, which, again, unlike something like Bulky Starmie or Salamence or Celebi, whenever Gengar switches in to try and check Metacham, it's toying with death if it gets it wrong, whereas the others, they can take a hit. So, yeah, that's been Metacham, and that's pretty much, those are our 6 fighting types. I mean, you look up the other fighting types in the game, and none of them are really OU viable. You have the 1 OU Heracross and then the 5 BLs, and, the Hitmons aren't good, Poliwrath, Primeape, these are, not fully evolved. So yeah, these are the good fighters in OU. They have a lot of tournament success. I would recommend combing through all the tournament replays you can find from this past year. SPL, Classic, Kalos Invitational, Permasand Invitational. Look into Kalos' YouTube channel if you want links to the server where those last 2 tournaments were hosted. And yeah, the fighting types are everywhere. They're incredibly strong. We've gone over their strengths here. And yeah, now you can get out there and throw them on a team. When in doubt, Baton Pass Zapdos. Fit in a Baton Pass Vaporeon if you're cool, a Sub Pass Vaporeon. Asta's team was nasty. He had the Sub Salic Vaporeon with the Sub Salic SD Heracross. So either way, there was a speed boost being passed, or it was getting a speed boost, or passing speed to other dangerous threats. So yeah, I would recommend hopping on the fighting train. It's moving full speed ahead, and something else that's cheesy. Anyway, so fighters are really strong. We know what they do. We know why each of these individual fighters do what they do specifically, and what fighters do as a whole. So get out there and pick your favorite. I will say that Breloom is the easiest to use because of Spore, followed by Hariyama because it has that tangible repeated defensive utility. And Blaziken makes for a good lead. It gets you off to a good start very often at the beginning of a game. And the hardest to use is probably Metacham, just because it does have it can get played around because it's in certain matchups because of its frailty and prediction reliance. But if you like predicting and you want big returns on your predictions, then Metacham is your Pokemon. So you know what to pair him with. Be careful of Dugtrio, for sure. Dugtrio is not Like, it's not trapping a full health Machamp or anything, but these guys are going to get chipped while they do what they do. In addition to being careful for Dugtrio, just make sure to watch out for their health. Don't let them take hits if they don't need it, so it's as hard to deal with them as possible. Get them free turns. Alright, I think I've said everything I want to. Thank you for watching. Catch you next time.